Now the question before us is, when you weigh the evidence for Christian theism against the evidence for naturalism, which way, on balance, does the evidence point? In support of a naturalistic answer to that question, I'm going to defend two basic contentions. One, naturalism is a simpler explanation than Christian theism, and two, naturalism is a more accurate explanation than Christian theism. Let's look then at my first basic contention. Naturalism is a simpler explanation than Christian theism. Naturalism and supernaturalism are symmetrical claims. Naturalism claims that the physical explains the mental, while supernaturalism claims that the mental explains the physical. Both claims are equally modest and equally coherent. Before examining the evidence, both positions are equally likely to be true. But now compare naturalism and Christian theism. Theism says everything that supernaturalism says, but adds on several additional claims, such as the non-physical mental entity which explains the natural world is a person, and that person created the world for a purpose, and that person is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good. Christian theism adds on even more claims to the claims of theism. Because Christian theism entails or implies supernaturalism, but could be false even if supernaturalism is true, it follows that prior to examining the evidence, Christian theism is less likely to be true than supernaturalism. And so Christian theism is also less likely to be true than naturalism. Let's turn then to my second basic contention. Naturalism is a more accurate explanation than Christian theism. Here, I'd like to present 9 lines of evidence that are more probable on naturalism than on Christian theism. Number 1, naturalism is the best explanation for the fact that physical matter exists. I want to be very clear. The existence of physical matter is logically compatible with theism. God could have created matter, but God could have also chosen to create other minds without physical bodies, such as angels, and therefore not needed to create a physical universe to support such bodies. Or God could have chosen to create nothing at all. In other words, God's existence doesn't entail physical matter. In contrast, naturalism implies that physical matter exists. In other words, if naturalism is true, then physical matter must exist. Since naturalism entails that physical matter exists, whereas theism does not, it follows that physical matter is evidence favoring naturalism over theism. Number 2, naturalism is the best explanation for the fact that so much of the universe is hostile to life. Discoveries in astronomy have revealed that the vast majority of the universe is incredibly hostile to life. It contains vast amounts of empty space, temperatures near absolute zero, cosmic radiation, and so forth. Given that life exists in this universe, the fact that so much of our universe is hostile to life is more probable on naturalism than on theism. Number 3, naturalism is the best explanation for the fact that all life, including conscious life, evolved from a common ancestor. To be sure, biological evolution is logically compatible with theism. God could have used evolution to create life, but God could have also used many other methods to create life, methods which are impossible if naturalism is true. On the other hand, if naturalism is true, evolution pretty much has to be true. Furthermore, since theism entails that if a physical world exists, it was created by a mind, theism leads us to expect that minds are fundamentally non-physical entities, and therefore that conscious life is fundamentally different from non-conscious life. But this, in turn, would lead us to expect that conscious life was created independently of non-conscious life, that evolution is false. And so the scientific fact of biological evolution is more likely on the assumption that naturalism is true than on the assumption that theism is true. Number 4, naturalism is the best explanation for the biological role and apparent moral randomness of pain and pleasure. Suppose you are inside a building that is caught on fire and all the exits are blocked. The fire gets closer and closer to you until you are actually in pain because of the intense heat. Suddenly, a group of firefighters arrive and are able to rescue you. Your pain in this case was biologically useful because it contributed to one or two biological goals: survival and reproduction. The naturalistic explanation for this is obvious. If human beings are the products of evolution by natural selection, then we would expect physical pain and pleasure to motivate human behavior in ways that aided survival and reproduction. But not all physical pain and pleasure are biologically useful. Consider, for example, the physical pain felt by a person killed in that same fire I just told you about. That pain was not biologically useful because it did not contribute to survival or reproduction. But it was biologically appropriate because it is biologically useful that humans, in general, feel pain when they come in contact with fire. Now, if naturalism is true, humans are the byproducts of evolution by natural selection, which is indifferent to human suffering. And so pain and pleasure that is biologically useless but appropriate is what we would expect if naturalism is true. On the other hand, if theism is true, God could fine-tune humans so that they only experience physical pain and pleasure when it was morally necessary. So theism leads us to expect that pain and pleasure are fundamentally moral phenomena which just happens to be connected to the biological goals of survival and reproduction. And that's a huge coincidence that naturalism doesn't need. It gets worse. Some pain, like the suffering endured by people trapped in burning buildings before they die, or people with terminal illnesses or injuries, and some pleasure, like the sexual pleasure enjoyed by the man who rapes an infertile woman, is biologically gratuitous. It does not contribute to survival or reproduction. On naturalism, this is just what we would expect. Blind nature has no way to fine-tune organic systems to prevent such pain and pleasure. On theism, however, this is extremely surprising. So this evidence is very much more probable on naturalism than on theism. Number 5. Naturalism is the best explanation for the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings. Paul Draper explains, "The majority of living things, including the majority of sentient beings, never flourish. Many more flourish for only a very small portion of their lives, and almost none who live a full life flourish for all of it. A naturalistic explanation of this is readily available. If populations of organisms increase geometrically, and this leads to a competition for the resources necessary to survive, then it is inevitable that a large percentage of all living things will not survive long enough to thrive. Many more will barely survive, and thus languish for all or almost all of their lives, and even those organisms that do flourish for much of their lives will, if they live long enough, ultimately languish in old age. A Darwinian naturalistic world is inevitably cruel, especially to the young, the old, and the genetically less fortunate." But if theism is true, then facts about the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings are exactly the opposite of what we would expect. If God exists, then God would allow sentient beings to suffer or languish only if he had good moral reasons for doing so. In other words, think about the following question. Is there a moral justification for using natural selection to produce a world in which most living things never or rarely flourish because they have to compete with each other for survival? If naturalism is true, the answer to that question could be yes or no. But if theism is true, the answer has to be yes. And that's a really big coincidence that naturalism doesn't need. So the flourishing and languishing of sentient beings provides independent evidence for naturalism and against theism. Number 6, naturalism is the best explanation for known facts about triumph and tragedy. There are 3 additional facts about good and evil which favor naturalism over theism. First, to paraphrase Paul Draper, our world contains much horrific suffering and relatively little glorious pleasure. As he puts it, indeed, triumph is the exception and tragedy the rule on our planet, where the deepest and the best aspirations of human beings are routinely crushed by a variety of circumstances beyond their control. Second, horrific suffering often destroys a person, at least psychologically, and prevents them from growing morally, spiritually, and intellectually. Third, many people do not seem to feel God's comforting presence during tragedies. Now, ask yourself, if God exists, why is there so much horrific suffering and so little glorious pleasure? Even after thousands of years of theological reflection, theistic philosophers still have no idea. They just assume that there must be a reason for God allowing evil. For example, Alvin Plantinga of Notre Dame University, one of the most influential theistic philosophers of our time, admitted, "Many of the attempts to explain why God permits evil seem to me shallow, tepid, and ultimately frivolous." Naturalists, on the other hand, have a plausible explanation. There is no all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing being to intervene, and therefore facts about triumph and tragedy are much more likely on naturalism than on theism. Number 7. Naturalism is the best explanation for the fact that human minds are dependent on the physical brain. Scientific evidence shows that human consciousness is highly dependent upon the brain. In this context, nothing mental happens without something physical happening. That strongly implies that the mind cannot exist independently of physical arrangements of matter. In other words, we do not have a soul. And this is exactly what we would expect if naturalism is true. But if theism is true, then it's possible for minds to exist without physical brains. Also, theism entails the existence of at least one unembodied mind, God. God's mind is not in any sense dependent on physical arrangements of matter. So the dependence of human minds on brains is evidence against the existence of any being who is supposed to have an unembodied mind, including God, and therefore the physical nature of minds is evidence favoring naturalism over theism. Number 8, naturalism is the best explanation for non-resistant non-belief in God. Imagine you're growing up in an orphanage and I told you I had met a man who claims to be your father and who really wants a relationship with you. Days, weeks, even months go by, but you never actually meet your father. You never get a card, letter, phone call. In fact, the only evidence that your father is alive is my claim that he exists. Why haven't you heard from him? Perhaps your father is ashamed for abandoning you. Or maybe he's a prisoner of war and his captors won't even let him write you. Although you hope your father is alive and wants to meet you, you remain skeptical. Just as you do not believe your father is alive and wants to meet you, there are people who do not believe that God exists. But notice that whatever reasons we might invent to explain your earthly father's absence do not explain their heavenly father's absence. At least some of the people who deny God's existence are non-resistant non-believers. As John Schellenberg explains, their non-belief is not in any way the result of their own emotional or behavioral opposition towards God or relationship with God or any of the apparent implications of such a relationship. Such non-believers are open to having a relationship with God. In fact, they may even want it, but are unable to have such a relationship. But why, if God exists, does that happen? On naturalism, blind nature doesn't care whether anyone believes in God, and so the fact of non-resistant non-believers is hardly surprising. On theism, however, this fact is very surprising. On theism, we would expect a perfectly loving God to always make a meaningful relationship available to those he loves. Number 9, naturalism is the best explanation for ethical disagreement. The philosophical discipline of ethics is notorious for its controversy. Not only do philosophers disagree over general ethical theory, such as utilitarianism or deontological ethics, they also genuinely disagree about the morality of specific acts, like war, abortion, the death penalty, gun control, and sexual behavior. The problem is not just that people disagree about morality. The problem is also that theists, including Christians, disagree about morality. Now, this tends to be very awkward for the Christian. A Christian, at least if he admits that there is genuine ethical disagreement, has to believe both that God wants humans to behave morally and that he has left them in the dark about whether specific kinds of behavior are morally acceptable. On naturalism, however, there is no God, just impersonal nature. And impersonal nature gives us even less reason to expect moral agreement than theism does. So ethical disagreement is more probable on naturalism than on theism. So, in sum, we've seen 9 lines of evidence that naturalism is true. If Mr. Vandergrift wants us to believe Christian theism instead, then he's first got to provide evidence of his own for Christian theism, and then show that it somehow outweighs all of the evidence for naturalism. Unless and until he does that, the naturalist can hardly be blamed for agreeing with philosopher Delos McCown, who wrote, "The invisible and the non-existent look very much alike." Thank you.